Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today, I'm honoured to be speaking with Dan Clements. Dan, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate the chance to chat and specifically meet you. Really appreciate it.
Well, I'm super excited to have you on. Why don't we get started by you introducing yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Yeah, so my name's Dan Clements. I work in elite coach development, currently working at the Welsh Rugby Union. Previously worked in hockey, so a bit of a varied background. Worked in hockey for the Welsh Hockey, and also worked for Wales Rugby League, working in the Rugby League pathway. So, yeah, fairly broad experience, I'd say.
Was that a bit of a challenge for you, a shift from hockey to rugby?
Yeah, I think it is. Change is always difficult, isn't it? But I think what I do always advocate that principles are the same across coaching, performance environments. Principles, we'll probably get into it today, really, but principles are always the same. I think the context is king, and always being able to understand and appreciate that context. So, yeah, it's definitely always a challenge, but I think having a good grounding in performance sport and coaching helps when you do change environments, because many people and many successful people have done it and continue to do it. So yeah, it's an interesting subject.
Was your background as a coach in a specific sport, or were you always coached across sports?
Yeah, so this is probably where it gets even a bit more bizarre. So I was a swimmer to start with.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So I was a swimmer. Swam nationally for your whole childhood, really, isn't it? And then sort of got into swimming teaching, and then played a lot of rugby. Enjoyed rugby coaching then off the back of that, and started to work through rugby league coaching and rugby union coaching, and really got into my coaching from that angle. And then those positions, they end up kind of leading into player development roles, and I think that's where my passion really lay at that point in time. And then player development roles led on to sort of performance leadership roles with hockey, and now back to specialising purely on the coaching, because it's something that I'm really fascinated by and really enjoy.
And so, what does elite coach development look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a whole variety of things. I think it's providing a support to elite coaches working across the professional game, but I think it's also providing a bespoke learning environment, learning program as best as we can for everybody that's working within that realm. Because again, we'll probably get into it today, but there's some great research out there about the need for learning to be meaningful and bespoke. It's our challenge and our duty to be able to provide that for people working within a professional space. So yeah, it can be anything from professional development programs through to working on the grass with coaches to sort of implement ideas, theories. So it's pretty broad, really.
So within the Welsh Rugby Union, are you very much embedded within the talent pathways? Is that where your day-to-day sort of position lies?
Yeah, a bit of both, really. So working with the pathway coaches and teams, but then also working within the regions with our professional coaches that are either working as first-team coaches or coaches that are on that pathway to move into first team. So sort of servicing the current coaches working there, but also trying to keep your heads up and see who's next and who will be making that transition into senior coaching in the future, and trying to help prepare them so we can kind of reduce the stress when they do make that move.
So we have been talking behind the scenes possibly the last few weeks, or at least the last month, because I spotted, I think we follow each other on Twitter, I spotted that you'd posted a research paper that has recently come out that you've been involved with alongside Kevin Morgan and Kerry Harris. And that research paper is entitled Adopting an Appreciative Inquiry Approach to Proposed Change within the National Talent Development System. And having dabbled in a little bit of appreciative inquiry over the past decade, it certainly caught my attention, and that's where I contacted you, and I was like, please come on the Sports Psych Show and discuss this paper, because I love the appreciative inquiry approach. So we're going to have a chat about this paper. I mean, I suppose before we get started, do you want to give us a bit of background, a bit of history as to where this paper came from? How comes you started dabbling yourself in appreciative inquiry?
Yeah, no problem. I should say to start with, we probably should have come up with a bit of a snappier title, because it's a little bit of a mouthful. But it came about from this idea of, I will say it was part of a doctorate that I've recently just completed as well. Okay. So it tied in quite nicely from a professional perspective.
Well, congratulations. So it's Dr. Dan Clements then, not Dan Clements.
Oh, after minor modifications, yes, that would be right.
Well, we'll get your title right this time. Dr. Dan Clements, thank you for being on the Sports Psych Show.
Brilliant. Yeah, so it came about from there, and I was talking with Kevin and Kerry around something that could be meaningful for me, my professional practice, but also, something that we were all really sort of interested in from a coach learning and a change perspective, because I will say straight from the start, I wanted to position it as this idea that coaches are the agents of change. So if we're looking at a change program, can we work with the coaches and through the coaches to be able to deliver change? So that's how it came about. I had a bit of a background in action research, so did a paper previously with Kevin Morgan around action research in a talent program. And on discussion, we kind of stumbled. Kevin obviously was already doing some work around appreciative inquiry, and it really caught my eye in terms of a theory and an idea, because of that idea of strength-based change. Because I'd probably say I'm a pragmatist, but also an optimist. So it was something that really interested me and something I wanted to try and engender within the pathway. Yeah.
Lots of rich detail there. Let's try and strip this back. You mentioned a term there, action research. What is action research?
Yeah, so action research, it came about, I think it started off in education. Teachers working to sort of improve their practice. And I think that's where it came and sort of struck a chord with me, from this idea that, a professional being able to drive their own development and research into their own practice, with that whole notion of trying to keep it as applied as possible. And that was something that struck a chord with me from reading all the research into coach learning about it needing to be situated, meaningful, and applied, and as embracing as much reflexivity as possible. So that's why action research as an idea kind of struck a chord with me, because myself, Kevin, and Kerry started to talk around this idea as the coach as the action researcher. So could we help coaches become action researchers into their own practice, with a view to change in practice? Because I think that's the key that we want to get across with coach learning is there a change in practice? And I know we were just talking about it then behind the scenes, about that idea of being able to change. I think that's the key, and why action research really appealed to me.
That's really interesting. So basically, action research, what I think I'm hearing you say, is research that's embedded within context, within the environment that you're coaching or you're involved in. Would that be right?
That's right. Yeah. So it's self-reflective. It's a social situation to improve practice and a better understanding of practice. Yeah, that's probably the snapshot assessment, I'd say.
So you mentioned yourself being a pragmatist. So it's quite a pragmatic approach. Any coach can essentially engage in this. They can research their own environment essentially and the behaviours within they're engaging in within their environment.
Yeah, 100%, and I think that's what we'll probably get into today. But also, I think that's one of the beauties of it. I think there's some great research there done previously that talks about the help of a knowledgeable other within the process. We'll probably get into that today because the paper talks around more collaborative approach as opposed to knowledgeable other. But that there's definitely options there and ways that coaches can sort of tap into this as an idea to be able to improve their own practice.
And of course, appreciative inquiry, which we will delve deeper into, that's a form of action research. So it's a practical and pragmatic approach or intervention that's linked to action research.
Yeah, that's right. So appreciative inquiry is a form of action research. The biggest difference, which you've already touched on, is this idea that it's strength based, and it's not this idea of we're looking for problems. This deficit lens that we generally put on when we're looking towards change. We're starting with strengths. And it kind of captures we'll get into it, but it captures that idea of the positivity to help people to be able to drive change within their own context.
So tell me a little bit about who was involved in this research. What coaches came from rugby or hockey?
Yeah, so it was in hockey. It's a talent pathway within hockey.
Okay. So it was a talent pathway within hockey.
Yeah.
Level of coaches.
Yeah. So what would you call it? So they're working at national age grade level and the pathway that leads into national age grade. So yeah, sort of that end of the pathway.
Okay, and so you open up the research paper by talking about a talent pathway and the key ingredients of an optimal talent pathway. For you, what are those? What are the key ingredients of an optimal talent pathway?
Yeah, so again, that's an absolutely great
Big
question.
question.
Yeah, I think there's been some great research done there, and I think it was on my level 4 program in rugby league where it was really opened my eyes to it. We were lucky to spend some time with Dave Collins up at UCLan, and I think that really opened my eyes into the research that was sitting behind talent pathways, and that's really sort of stoked the fire, I suppose, since and really got me to start thinking around what really makes that talent pathway. And for me, I'd agree with some great stuff out there that talks around long-term development focus, development of psychological skills, key, coach-athlete relationships. And then a good friend of mine, Vinny, talks around the coherence between coaches, which I think is absolutely huge. But yeah, I'd say they're probably the main ones.
So what I'm hearing there is great talent pathways incorporate coach-athlete relationships, coherent communication, psychological skills, and I suppose the motivation piece as well.
Yeah, we kind of get into that into the paper and talk, because there's some great ideas around there about motivation being one of the key drivers around engagement within the pathway. And we talk around the idea of the coach being able to capture that motivation as best as we can to be able to sustain engagement within the pathway, all the ups and all the downs.
So what were you trying to do with this research project? You've got your talent pathways there in Welsh hockey. You're now going to do a project with a dozen or so coaches at different levels of that talent pathway. What was the actual goal of this project?
Yeah, it all comes down to change for me. So the idea of we want to change practice, we want to change the way the program's delivered. Generally, that's approach from a top-down method. Here's a presentation. Let's all get in the room. Let's talk about. We'll do X. You do Y. Let's get on with it, and we all kind of know our roles. Those traditional probably change models that come from the business world, where I really wanted to look at it from this idea of collaboration, and we already touched on it. That idea of strength-based. How can we change this project and this program and improve our practice with a methodology that would help that? And that's how it came about from appreciative inquiry and the need for change. It wasn't just a case of let's see what happens. There was a genuine need because of developments within the pathway, but also the coach's desire to be better. Because I think that's the point. Everybody wants to do better, and everybody wants to do a better job. So what could we do, and how could we approach it differently to what was already out there?
Okay, so this is interesting. So to optimize your talent pathway, you've got a dozen or so coaches in the room. And what you're saying to me is that, in essence, the history of change management, improvement, leans towards a top-down approach. Here's a presentation. Everybody's got to learn this. Everybody's got to go away and execute this. But you wanted to do it slightly differently. You wanted to, I suppose, use a methodology that's going to task the coaches to find their own solutions, to discuss strengths, areas that they perhaps want to improve, and to find solutions.
That's a great summary. Yeah, that's a real good summary. I definitely say that because it's. I think this isn't me, saying top-down approaches don't work. Clearly they do, and they have worked in other elite sports and other environments. They do work. This was just a way of looking at it from a context that's probably been through some significant change up until this point. And to be fair, I think we've probably also got to think from the coach's perspective. Coaches get sick of change because they're the end user. They're the person at the coalface.
Yeah.
So how can we work with coaches so it doesn't come across of, here we go again. Here's a new theory. Right now we've got to go from this angle. How can we work with those coaches to get them more invested in the process to be able to help change their practice, which changes obviously the environment and the culture of the organisation.
So rather than the coaches being told what to do, you're empowering them to come up with their own solutions. You're empowering them to come up with their own formula, essentially.
Yeah, that's right. Because I think one of the best quotes that we got through the data was, here we from a coach as we started. Here we go. Here's another theory. Because it's gone from right. We're working on here everywhere. Right. We're delivering a game-based approach. Right. We're delivering a constraints-led approach over here. Right now we're going to do this, and we're starting to flick-flacking between theories where actually we could start to look what really matters within our context and make sure that we find a way that works for us based on, good evidence-based research.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of appreciative inquiry, the methodology you essentially used to help coaches find their path, essentially. Do you think that organisations, clubs, teams tend to lean towards a top-down approach because that feels neater, that feels more linear? It feels like we have to have a document created by the people at the very top of the organisation or the club or the team in order to give us some structure and some orderliness, if you like. Whereas what you've ventured on feels a little bit perhaps chaotic, feels a bit disordered.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's probably less chaotic than I'm probably making out, but it's. I think you are right. I think I'd say we're probably more hardwired to see leadership and change as this top-down, all-known leader will show everybody the way that things should be done. That again, that probably comes from the business world where it probably comes from a sport angle. It's quite safe if we've got this document and this framework that we'll all work towards. You kind of everyone can understand their role and play their part, which again makes sense. But I think what we wanted to do was look at it, this idea of change, and can you make change relative to the environment? So change will happen because you're doing something at the simplest level. By doing something will change for good or for bad. So can we look at it as a way of saying, if we're going to change something, can we change something that means or something that is meaningful to this group of coaches and people and players that we're working with?
I love that term, change relative to the environment, and then meaningful to the people who are within that environment. Those people, they're closest to the grass, aren't they? They're closest to the players. So why wouldn't you include them in that process of change or that process of improvement?
Oh, 100%. That would definitely be my mantra. Why wouldn't you include those people? Because they're the ones that are shaping your culture, shaping your environment. Because at the end of the day, you're either a pathway architect or someone that's trying to help develop the pathway. Can we empower those people within really key roles to own it and really want to drive that change? I think that's the overriding notion for me.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I just want to check in and take a look at where we are right now. So as an elite coach developer in Welsh hockey, you were mindful of continuing to improve the talent pathway towards an optimal talent pathway. Research has demonstrated certain aspects, certain features of pathways are related to an optimal talent pathway. And so you've decided to do a piece of action research whereby you've got a dozen or so hockey coaches from different areas of that talent pathway in a room, and you're now going to ask them to brainstorm ways in which they feel that the pathway can improve. But the methodology you're going to use is appreciative inquiry. So tell us about appreciative inquiry. What on earth is that, Dan?
It's a great question. So appreciative inquiry, straight off the bat, strength-based. It's a positive lens towards change. It doesn't look towards deficits. It doesn't look towards what you can do. It uses the power of strengths to identify this is a real quick synopsis, but what's done really well within an organization. How can we build on that to get where we want to get to, and how are we going to get there? And then we go through this cycle of discovering new ways and better ways of doing things. And it's generally represented in the 4D cycle, if anybody ever did look at it. But this idea of discovery, what we do really well, dream, where do you want to get to, either personally or as a collective. Design, so really spending some time to design this idea of how you're going to get there, and then into the discovery phase, getting out there and really discovering the destiny. So
this is really interesting, Dan. You opened up there by talking about deficit, or you used the word deficit. And it's certainly in my work in sport, developing elite sport, I do think we tend to be entrenched in a deficit culture. We're always talking about what's wrong or what's not there, or what I suppose we need to improve because of weaknesses. We don't necessarily orient our attention towards what works, what's great, what's strong, and that can be quite demoralizing at times. And I think my understanding of what appreciative inquiry is saying is actually it's not always that useful to orientate oneself towards the weaknesses, to look at the problem, to have expansive language around problem and to be problem oriented. Actually, we want to direct attention towards strengths, what's working, what's great, And these could leave fantastic clues. These leave clues as to how we can build solutions for the future. No question there, Dan, but does that resonate with you?
Yeah, 100%. I think we're hardwired to look for problems, and if you put your coaching hat on and elite sport hat, we're always looking for what's the problem, how can we fix it, how can we do this one thing better, or do whatever we're trying to do better. So automatically we look for the problem. Whereas this idea of strengths, I think a good friend of mine, Justin Price, working at the FA, he always talked around this idea of super strengths. Why don't we talk to people about their super strengths? What do you do really well, and how can we harness that and use it more? Because I think culturally, not just in sport, outside of sport, we're probably a problem solving type nation. We can't where other nations are really good at highlighting what they do really well, we're probably a little bit more, I don't know, reserved. We never want to shout up about what we're good at, or what we're really passionate about. So it's a good way of starting to change the perspective and change the conversation, I think.
Do you think it's also because we don't actually believe we can find progress within strengths? We just believe that we can find progress by examining weaknesses and by striving to improve those weaknesses.
Agree, yeah, because on that point, when you find the weakness, you can then prove that you fix something, and that's probably, again, a cultural thing. Whereas if you went from a strength-based perspective, it's harder to prove up. Well, anything from a social perspective is really hard to prove, but I think it's doubly hard as opposed to that idea of this area. If we took it back to coaching, this area of coaching practice doesn't work, or this part of the program doesn't work. Let's fix it. I think flipping that switch to say, what do we do really well, and how can we do it better? That changes the dynamic within that social setting, and it really, really drives home that idea of focusing our effort on strengths, which is ultimately what appreciative inquiry talks around.
As you're speaking there, Dan, I'm picturing coaches within clubs, within organisations, getting together in a room and having conversations around strengths, around what's working, around what's great. And I would imagine that that's a really positive thing to do. And appreciative inquiry uses this term positivity principle, that it revolves around a principle of positivity, essentially, rather than orienting ourselves towards our negativity bias, I suppose, as human beings.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we've got an inherent bias to probably look for problems ourselves. You're 100% right. So it's that there's some great principles at the core of AI, and positivity is front and center, and no surprise, it did come out quite strongly within the research and within the paper. But I think that idea of constructionism, one of the constructionist principle that sits within it, that individuals co-construct reality and continually make sense of what's going on around them, is one of the super strengths for me around appreciative inquiry and that action research approach.
Well, let's do some sense making now. It would be brilliant if you take us through the process you went through. You talked about 4 Ds of appreciative inquiry. Take us back to that room. Dozen coaches in the room. You're facilitating alongside Kevin and Kerry. Take us through each step. So you started with the discovery. Well, what's this first D, discovery? Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so discovery it's a personal thing as well as a group thing. So we ask the coaches to, at the first stage, why do you coach? why did you get involved in coaching? And that is with the idea of pulling it back to personal drivers. What's the driver for you to be in this position? Why with this program? Why do you want to work here? And you start that gets it's a real critical reflection for a coach to really start to pull that back, because it gets you to cut through the rhetoric that you usually see within these situations, and that's a personal task. We then ask them to be shared. So coaches sharing those ideas again amplifies strengths and amplifies this idea of positivity, which gets people to feed off each other and sort of start to share more. This discovery then starts to delve into, right, that's your personal perspective, right? As a collective, now can we define what we do really well? What's the best things that we do within this program? Without presenting, ideas of what they should say, such as, I don't know, coaching practice or leadership, whichever sort of headline you wanted to get into. But straight from the bat, just talking to each other and sharing examples of ideas and stuff that we do really well. What do we do really well within this program? And that process alone starts to drive this positivity principle, but also this constructionist angle, where people start to use really good adjectives, because within AI, this idea of language forms meaning. The language that you use makes sense to people around you, so it starts to highlight what the collective really think about what they do, as opposed to, again, flipping the switch where if you took it back 12 months or 24 months, I'd probably be at the front saying, look, I think we do this really well, but can we get better at this? And that's that idea of the participants owning that idea of discovering what they do well.
Really interesting stuff. I mean, it starts with coaches sharing their why they coach. Do you do that individually? Do they just stand up in the room and share with other coaches, or do you get them into pairs to have a conversation first? How did you do that?
Yes, we used some crib sheets to start with.
Okay.
Because I think it's a great quote from someone else about thinking in ink. Putting it down in ink, so gets you to sort of commit to something. So yeah, some crib sheets to start with, a real personal experience. Then yes, start to move that towards pair work, where in pairs they started to share and share some common themes. And then we brought that back to the group then, and really just pushed it out there and said, would anybody be willing to share some insights? And then, it's probably it's in any of those situations, it's the who goes first type scenario. Luckily, someone did, and that it really helped to then, it's kind of like the old cascade effect. The next person went, and people were talking about what they'd spoken about with their partner, and we really start to get into some real personal insights then that people didn't mind sharing. I think it's quite difficult, because it's anyone knows, because we've all been in those situations where they're quite difficult sometimes. It's probably down to the sort of the facilitative role, but also the idea of how can you be non-judgmental, and probably getting into your world there around how can you be non-judgmental when people do start to share something that's quite personal.
And do you find the sharing of why I coach facilitates the next section, which is to start sharing experiences within their coaching practice, within the pathway?
Yeah, because people can make the direct links, but probably at the top end, you've already opened up with that idea of constructionism. So,
yeah,
they're starting to work together, but also there's that idea of it's a safe space. So, we can start to talk about these kind of things, and without fear of judgment, which is it's always difficult within a coach development and coach learning setting, I found. So it did help from that angle.
That's interesting. So firstly, it's a bit of a warm-up. Secondly, it frames the rest of the day. And thirdly, it provides psychological safety or increases psychological safety.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Interesting. And then you move on to sharing stories of success, reflecting on strengths, what's working, what's going great, and I suppose sharing what's inside people's minds about their experiences within the pathway. That's the next section.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So it kind of builds on that idea of, you know, if someone shared an idea of, I don't know, for example, you know, coaching for me is about, it's about seeing a player develop and achieve their full potential.
Yep.
You know, next discussion they have where they get into, someone might link that to, well, you know, I think we look after the, you know, the whole player as an example. You know, we're not just thinking of them as a hockey player, we're thinking of them as a, you know, a human being that's got some potential within hockey. You know, and then they start to cascade and build ideas around that, what they do really well.
On this particular day, did you feel a lifting of the mood? Did the mood change in any respect as people started to share these kind of success stories?
Yeah, it did for sure. You know, there's a palpable, you know, apathy in the room to start with, where it's we've all been there.
Yeah.
We've all been there, haven't we? And you know, I've done a presentation on this as part of my doctorate, where, you know, I think I entitled it "It's not all sunshine and rainbows." You know, we're not all standing around, sort of high fiving in semicircles, etc. It's this idea of, you know, there is a grittiness to it, but it's the way you facilitate it and the way you pitch the ideas around tasks that then builds this idea of psychological safety and this idea of people being able to share positive stories without fear of judgment or ridicule.
So are you trying to pick out themes as each coach shares their story?
Yeah, so I think we did pick that out of the data in terms of, was there any themes in terms of why people started coaching and why they started coaching specifically within this talent pathway. But I think the biggest focus was then to start to try and unpick the themes about what we do really well, because then that you can kind of get a feel then for where the group thinks they're at, but also in the back of your mind you've got this, you know, you've got this idea of, you know, the multitude of research that's out there about a really optimal talent pathway. You can start to make links to that, to those ideas.
That leads on to the dream phase. Tell me about the dream phase.
Yeah, so it was a couple of tasks really. Some individual stuff. You know, can you write a short I can't remember what we called it, but sort of a short story, say, about what the pathway would look like in, I don't know, 15 years if you were looking back. You know, what does it look like in 15 years' time?
Yep.
So that's, again, an individual one to start to get people to think about what matters to them. And then you bring it together into small group work. So the small group work starts to really delve into, you know, what as a collective we want it to look like. You know, and that's quite a strong link to that constructionist principle. So we all start to really build this idea of this co-constructed reality of what we want it to be, which leads in nicely then to the right design. How are we going to get there?
Before we head on to the design, I suppose in the dream phase, people are borrowing from what they've spoken about in the discovery phase.
Yes, definitely. So they're already linking into what they know they do really well. But then I think this is what links in quite nicely to, we all do it. You know, we all do it on social media. We do it internally from a professional perspective. We share articles, stories, you know, look at this success story. So everyone's got stuff that they've read, looked, seen, you know, that they then start to go, right, this gives me an idea of the future that I'd like to develop within my context. And here is the opportunity for me to have a say within what that looks like.
Mm. So once we've shared a dream phase, we've shared a vision of the future, a future perfect, if you will. We're then moving on to a design phase.
Yes. Yeah. So design, we start to look at then. So what are the elements we need to look after to make that dream a reality? Because that's the idea. In the dream phase, you've talked about this. One of the principles of AI is this anticipatory principle. So you're always about this idea of what could be. You know, you're never going to get there. What could it be? The design phase then starts to delve into what it takes to get there. And what elements do we need to develop, build on to be able to achieve that reality? And, you know, we start to borrow stuff there from the discovery phase, but also, you know, what new things might we need to, you know, delve into to be able to get there? And that's where the coaches really come alive, because, you know, I think that's where they, you know, that's where they live. That's their, you know, that's their bread and butter on the grass, really.
So they're essentially brainstorming new ideas.
Yes. Yeah.
But also borrowing from the past, also borrowing from what works.
Yeah. So they know what works, because we've covered that off in the discovery phase, and what they do really well. It's now, if we want to get to this idea of this program that's, you know, developing future internationals on a regular basis, what are the things that we need to be able to do to be able to get there? There'll be some stuff that we're all doing really well, but what ideas, and that starts to come out in the paper then, what themes do we want to look at in terms of being able to develop that? What do we as a group, what do we want to dive into?
Interesting. You refer in the paper to something called provocative proposition. Sounds like the process culminates in this. What is a provocative proposition?
Yeah, I wondered if you'd ask about that. Yeah, so this provocative proposition, again, another mouthful. This idea of a statement of intent. So can we build a statement of intent that drives and becomes the North Star that we kind of lean back to? And it's in the research and the text, you know, and from all the previous work in AI, probably from a business perspective, is quite straightforward. But as you can imagine, when you get to coaching, it's a bit more difficult, because there needs to, for me, and again, linking to the work that Vinny did around coherence, there needs to be absolute clarity on what we mean by something. You know, one of the easiest ones is always athlete-centered. You know, that gets bandied about so much. So if we're going to put that in a provocative proposition, how can we, you know, can we define it, and can we understand what it means to everybody? Back to that idea of co-constructive reality. So it was definitely a difficult task, but a good one, because again, it engineers discussion and starts to engineer this idea of the generative capacity of AI. So people starting to build ideas, build new ideas, which really helps as part of the process.
So provocative, because everybody constructs the world differently, their own world differently, and so subsequently it's challenging to get agreement within the room.
Yeah, not so much provocative because it's hard to get agreement. It's provocative because it provokes you as an individual. So provokes you to be able to want to achieve that vision and achieve that statement that you set out. That's the provocative element.
Gotcha. Right. So it's almost like, as you say, a statement of intent, an action plan, a statement related to an action plan moving forward.
Yeah, that's right. And it's got to summarize pretty much what you've talked around in your design. So if we've talked around, you know, we talked around in this piece around coach-athlete relationships, autonomy and leadership. So you need a provocative proposition that meets all three of those, because then it's that North Star that brings people back to it as you get into the destiny phase about, all right, these are the things that we're working towards.
So, what came out of that day, Dan, with the paper in question? What were the outcomes?
Yeah, so there was a couple of bits really. I think the the main crux of the day was this idea of we kept it applied. So it was applied to that group of coaches within that context to be able to positively own their own development and their own change program from that point forward. I think from an insights perspective, it really showed us the potential for positivity within such an environment, a coach development or coach learning environment, and also really highlighted the generative capacity that AI as a methodology has within that group. Because there's been some great work that's already shown that this really built on that, I believe. But I'd always advocated back to this idea of keeping it applied, and the ability of those coaches then to own something as they walk out of that room that wasn't just a at worst case an email, please can you try and do this, or the usual CPD days where, look, can we just try and work towards this new framework. It was more of a collaborative approach to change and their practice on a day-to-day basis, which again is ultimately what action research is about.
Yeah, absolutely. Keeping it grounded within the environment. I mean, I was going to ask you there, you've given us one piece of advice for those coaches, leaders who are interested in appreciative inquiry. What advice would you give to them in terms of utilizing it? Pitfalls, things to watch out for, ways to go about it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think coaches, some coaches are real optimists and strength based anyway. And I go back to that quote I said. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. It's not because there's a gritty reality about things need to get done in elite sport, from a playing perspective and a coach perspective. But I think the very best coaches, they do look at players as human beings with this idea of what can they do, what can they do really well, and how can I help that player be the best player that they can be. And if a coach is interested in it, I'd definitely encourage them to delve into the principles that sit behind, appreciative inquiry or strength-based change. I think there's, you'd probably know it better than me, Dan, but I picked up a little story or a quote around Jack Nicklaus and his idea of, I think it was in one of his books around, we need to repeat that idea of I'm gonna hit the ball right down the middle of the fairway. I'm not approaching the board to say, God, I don't want to hit the trees. And I think that's a real nice way for a coach to start to think about how they see player development or how they see coaching. Is it I'm mitigating risk in that player or this team, or am I looking at them as, what can they do and what could we be? That strength-based appreciative inquiry approach helps with that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting there, Dan, because as you're speaking there, I'm thinking of almost like inhibition and threat, as opposed to the positive notion of sort of challenge and working towards. I'm thinking there of Jack Nicklaus brainstorming around what he does to rip that ball down the middle, as compared to being concerned about and dwelling on what he's doing when he slices it off into the trees on the right. One feels empowering and the other one feels oppressive almost. And it's I mean, I suppose a question for you there is the suggestion here that we completely ignore what's going on with the slice, or are you saying that actually within that rip down the middle, you have the solutions for the slice?
Yeah, and I think it changes your focus, as an individual. So from a coach's perspective, but also from a player's perspective, if we kept it grounded with the player, or Jack Nicklaus from that example, I think it changes your focus and it gives you new knowledge about what does work as opposed to, what doesn't work, and really dials that up from a strengths perspective. And you catch yourself doing it all the time, don't you? Took my daughter swimming last night. Let's do a length, 25 meters. Never done 25 meters before. Oh, what if I don't make it? What if you do? The comeback was, well, could you get me some chocolates from the shop? We won't get into the the reward angle, but it's this idea of how can you change your outset and your outlook as a coach, or as a person, I suppose.
It makes me think of that adage: catch yourself doing stuff well.
Yes, definitely. And I think that's the beauty of probably this paper or appreciative inquiry from system developers or pathway architects. How can you, to steal your line there, if you caught the people that within your charge doing something well, how would that change the dynamic? How would that change the relationship, or the environment that you deliver? Because I think one of the things I want to get into on the next paper is this idea of developing this appreciative learning culture, which that who wouldn't want to work in an environment where it's pretty positive and everyone's working towards a common goal of optimizing change.
And as you said, that an appreciative learning culture, I'm also thinking of an appreciative performance culture. And I wanted to share this with you. I mean, I'm often getting emails or messages on social media from coaches whose team are perhaps going through a slump of form, or they're coming towards the end of the season and they want to finish strong, and they ask my advice. And I borrow from appreciative inquiry. I mean, not going through the whole 4D scenario, but almost just the first D, which is discovery, especially the slump in form scenario, is actually to hold a mini appreciative inquiry around, well, what has worked in the past, what has been strong, what is good. When we have one, if this team is going through a slump in inverted commas in form, when we did win earlier in the season, what were we doing? How were we going about things? What enabled us to win? I think even in a mini version of AI, appreciative inquiry, it can be quite a powerful tool.
Oh, 100%. And, I think Kevin Morgan said to me many years ago, when you believe in something, you start to see it in everything, which is, one of the things I have to check myself on. But, conversations, some of our coaches within Wales at present, they do it so well. They look at the possibilities, look at the strengths. How can we build on those strengths? And it's a real good, reminder for me to then, within conversations, like to your point there, what got us to this point, what got you to this point, and how can we maximize that, and steal that idea of super strength and really, don't shy away from it.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said, Dan. Really interesting. It's a fascinating research paper, and from my perspective, I can't reinforce this notion of embedded enough. I think helping coaches to brainstorm what's strong within their environment, within their context, is such a useful form of information for leaders, for those at the top, if you like. I don't see necessarily how one creates a positive environment and an optimal pathway without that information, without the inclusion of coaches, with information from the ground level. essentially at the coalface.
Spot on, yeah, and I think that's that's probably the main point, isn't it? They're at the coalface. The coaches are the ones that are on the grass. They're the ones that have the biggest influence on the players, and that player's development and your ultimate success as an NGB in this case. Whether that be elite success in terms of world ranking points or success on the international stage, or the players just love for the game, and stays wedded to that sport for the rest of their life because that coach has had the biggest impact on them. If we can't engage coaches in that process, I think, from my perspective, and that's probably a real bias now, I think we'd struggle for that impact.
Yeah, well said. I think of engaging coaches to engage players.
I think that's the only way, because we've argued this idea of coaches are the agents of change, and there's been some great work around that from a research perspective, and it's probably just keeping that fresh in our heads as pathway leaders, architects, people who are in positions that have influence around coaches. They're the ones that are doing the work. They're the ones that are going to drive the change from any agenda that's linked towards sport. So how can we help and support them as best as possible without being this, oppressive top-down, can you just try doing it this way approach that we're so used to.
Interesting. Dan, that was awesome, mate. Thank you so much for that information. I know it would have tapped the interest of the Sports Site Show audience. If people want to learn more about AI, appreciative inquiry, or perhaps have a question for you, are you on social media? Do you want to be found? If so, please do share your Twitter handle or whatever social media you've got.
Yeah, so I think we all want to be found. We don't want to be lost. No, social media. So yeah, Twitter's Clemo12, I think. But yeah, more than happy to pick up a conversation on AI and action research from an applied perspective. Yeah, really enjoy that and look forward to it if anybody did want to.
Perfect. Dan, thanks so much for your time.
No, thank you, Dan. Really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Site Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.